rosse bandiere, o proletari alla riscossa, bandiera rossa trionferà. Bandiera rossa deve trionfar, bandiera rossa deve trionfar, bandiera rossa deve trionfar, e viva il comunismo e la libertà, avanti il popolo alla riscossa, bandiera rossa, bandiera rossa.
David, do you want to speak? David is in Washington and he's on the chat list. He's giving some absolutely astounding reports. Would you like to speak now, David?
Sorry, I think I'm now with you.
Okay, great.
You know, a while ago, a black poet, Jill Scott Heron, wrote that the television would not announce the revolution. In fact, the way he put it was, the revolution will not be televised. But yesterday, in a remarkable video I saw, a black woman confronted the National Guard. There were men all around her, but she was the spokesperson. And she demanded that these white troops give the knee, kneel down as a condition for being allowed on the streets at all. You are here to protect us, and what are you doing, is what she said. I put it up on the WIN Facebook. It's one of the most remarkable things I've ever seen. And can I say that as a South African in this situation, I've seen things even seen in South Africa. The barbarity of police violence against demonstrators is quite extraordinary. Let me just mention, in South Africa, there's the Writers' Assemblies Act. I think it's still in existence. You are meant to be given a warning that there will be action taken unless you desist from your activity, whatever it is. In DC, just 2 days ago, when the president wanted to take a walk, peaceful demonstrators were pushed back, and without any warning, they opened up with tear gas and rubber bullets. And one of the women there, the tactic of the marchers and the demonstrators is to put white women in the front rank because they felt that the troops would not shoot at them, and it protects the black youth behind. And they shot this white woman, who's, by the way, a daughter of a military officer, just to give you her class character. And she took 5 rubber bullets. She lay there bleeding. It's not, all of this is not quite there on the video, but you should listen to the way in which she spoke. It's quite unbelievable. You should listen to, you should listen to the exchanges which there are on some of these videos. It's beyond belief. The kind of debates which are taking place in the movement. I think that Kenan, Tia, and Cliff have given us some flavor of it, but the words, the exact exchanges are remarkable. Let's just take this question of the problem of looting, which Kenan raised. I mean, obviously it's not comfortable for people to be able to see that the local shop where they're buying is actually on fire. It's not comfortable at all for people to know that the next day they're going to have to go out and try and find food, or the next day thereafter. And yet in the communities and the marches, you can see these debates taking place about what to do. Are we degrading what we are doing by doing this? Can we organize internally? Can we have self-discipline? In other words, can we build a revolutionary organization which can both fight and also have forms of discipline which are going to propel a movement forward, not only from our neighborhood, but from city to city. Unbelievable. It's, I think, 175 cities are in motion at the moment, and some, as in Tia, feeling relatively isolated, and others actually coming on stream. How do we give the solidarity That's what's being debated right now, and there's a huge march taking place at this moment in DC to assert people's power against the battle center, which the White House has now become. And we can see that there's a crisis which is quite extraordinary. I could go over a few other examples, but I think the fact, just imagine this, that those white troops ended up taking the knee on the demand of a black woman. And when some of them didn't want to take the knee, the commanding officer ordered him to take the knee. Now, that is something I've not seen anywhere. And it does show something important. How was it that that black woman stood for more than 10 minutes taking a video of what was happening to George Floyd? How did she know that what she was doing? I mean, apparently she was terrified with the consequences. But, it's an extraordinary rupture between the state, which is doing its own thing, and society, which is changing. And society, I mean, despite what people may see, internationally about the states, there is change taking place. And it's positive change. I mean, you can see that, to be gay, you do not have to hide now. There are ways in which black people are expressing themselves in the most extraordinary way and winning, popular support and approval. Taking the knee now has become normal. Black Lives Matter was a slogan just down the road here at the Congregational Church, and some members of the church said that it's not necessary. Even some black members of the church felt it's unnecessary. Now it's on the streets. It's a street sign. It's actually emblazoned on the roads. You have to travel that road. You're traveling that road. If you're the biggest racist, you will have to know what the character of that place is. Yesterday, just down the road here, a young white girl, it should be mentioned, had a slogan, Black Lives Matter, and a white cyclist, apparently a policeman, although he was in civilian clothes, I went and tore it out of her hands. She was in tears, but the community was outraged and is now facing prosecution. Imagine a young girl, we're looking to the youth, and when we talk about the youth, we're actually looking to children now, not to just youth, to be able to make the stand and to take the message of resistance right down into the schools. At the school where my daughter teaches, the teachers and the students are insisting that you make a clear statement about the school being totally opposed to race happened and to the clampdowns that are taking place. Now, that's a conservative headmistress, but she's now going to have to do this. So everywhere in society, there's a revolt. There's a changes taking place from below, and there's resistance from above, where Trump can say that America is in which the military have to dominate. When he makes that statement, it's blood-curdling. But within hours, the military leaders, at least the past military leaders, are saying that's the last thing they want to see. Now, it's extraordinary. What a division in the ruling class, where the crazy elements are speaking out and calling for blood to flow. And the officers, or the commanding officers, the supreme generals of America, are saying this is not the road that they want to take. They know that if they put the troops into the cities, there will be tens of thousands of tears. People like tear, marvelous black women who stand head and shoulders in their communities and in my eyes throughout the country, telling those troops to take the knee. And imagine they have to take the knee. What humiliation to one of the most powerful armies the world has ever seen. So we are in an extraordinary situation, and now the question is, what comes of this? In the 1960s, I hope Richard will touch on this, we saw uprising after the uprising. I was in the States as a foreign student in 1964. As I flew out in 1964, there was smoke arising from Harlem. I could see it out the window. In the 1960s, later, in flames. In 1992, there was Watts. Now, what comes out of this? This is where we are a critical factor. The Tiers, the Cliffs, the Kennans, the Richards, all of us are critical to what happens out of this. Can we work together with this most courageous level of young leadership, which is arising in the marches, and take them on to a deeper understanding of what is the nature of democracy, the deformed nature of democracy in the United States, which many people are still quite proud of, but still, you know, there's such a contradiction because it's just not working. And how do we develop the community policing? Well, don't not even use the word policing, just community lives, and without violence, without murder, without the shots and the night. Could I mention that in DC, during the weekends, it's a bit like London. You do have these reports of a child which is 10 years old or 6 years old being shot by a stray bullet because of gang warfare. I'm sure people in Cape Town know the same. We can't live like this. So we have crime, we know that. We have all kinds of crazy things happening. At the same time, this brutality is not an answer to anything. In fact, this is the problem in the first place. So we face this, how do we develop this dialogue? How do we take this mass action, the most marvelous youth, which is, you know, coming into motion at this time, and take it forward? One of the youth was asked on a radio this morning, on the black radio station that I'm listening to, you know, what's coming of this? When are you guys going home? And they said, not anytime soon. It's blisteringly hot here in Washington. People desperately need water to be able to continue hour after hour in the sun and in the demonstrations. In the afternoon, it's like Africa. There are thunderstorms. And one of the troops, by the way, was hit by a thunderbolt, which just shows where, you know, the people upstairs are thinking about things. But you see this development, to be able to stand there day after day. It reminded me of the marches and the demonstrations in Trafalgar Square in London against apartheid, where people refused to go home, and there were 24-hour vigils to be able to get rid of apartheid. Now, it sounded crazy, and I personally couldn't quite see the point, but it did have a certain point. The point here is that the vigil is until they can get Trump out of office. It has to be turned politically to know it's that, and then what else? What else is happening that's going to make a complete change in society and make a future for Black youth and for white youth together? This is the most marvelous movement I've yet experienced, and I'm celebrating together with the comrades in Minneapolis, in Oakland, and Louisville. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you, David. Very, very good contribution. We seem to have lost Richard. I hope he's on the way back. But we have two comrades who've got their hands up. Ayanda has been waiting for a long time. Ayanda, are you ready?
All right. Thank you very much, comrades. Am I audible? Well, I just wanted to check that what is happening in America is what could be referred to as a historical moment. Historical riot. I was listening to Tia Edison. That it also seeks to reconfigure the policing. But I'm wondering in my mind, I'm just throwing loose ideas. Do we understand, are there any in the riots or in the rebellion For example, do we understand a state under capitalism to be violent? Do we understand racism to be racial, but also problematize it in class?
And
Their struggles are the struggles of the world, are our struggles. They also exposes the failures state. These are just some of. I'll write my points.
I'm afraid you are fading in and out. I think
asked Ayanda to put his questions in the chat because we couldn't hear.
Yes, if you could put your points in the chat so we can read your point, please, Ayanda. Okay. Jim Chrisley, you're waiting to speak. Jim, you there?
Yeah, okay, Roger, thanks. Can I say I found the whole thing totally electrifying. The contributions today have been quite magnificent, inspiring, and honesty, and being honest about the challenges and the difficulties, not just the absolutely exhilaration of being on the front line. It has been genuinely quite inspiring. I don't want to repeat the points made, just to draw out some other comments. I first went to the States in the summer of '67. I spent the whole summer over there. It was the years of civil rights, the anti-Vietnam War. I followed it many times. I even pretend to teach American history. I've never seen anything quite like this. And I can't recall a time in American history quite like it. People are trying to compare it to the 1968 and so on, and that Trump is clearly trying to do that and to play the playbook of a law and order president. But what you're seeing is that the mass protests from below have opened up cracks within the American ruling class. I've never seen anything like it. It's not just the past ones of Mattis's statements this week, the former defense secretary, coruscating on Trump, and Mike Mellon, the former chief of staff, and so on. But it's also the existing ones. Anyone seen the statement by the commanders of the Sixth Fleet, the American Sixth Fleet, which the existing commanders, restating values of the Declaration of Independence, the General and Chair of the Joint Staff, and then, of course, you've even got the ructions with Trump and his hawkish Defense Secretary Mark Esner. You've seen many corporations all rushing to dissociate themselves from Trump. All the past presidents and so on, all were dissociating themselves as well. And the point that David made, I saw that video of that young black woman confronting the National Guard. You could see that some of the members of the National Guard didn't want to do it, but the commander was insistent. And so her first demand was that they marched with them, as some police have been doing. And you've seen police actually kind of putting down their batons and doing it under the pressure of that mass movement from below. I mean, what they hope, clearly, the split within the American ruling class, is that they can channel this all back into the safe hands of their reserve of Joe Biden in November. That's their aim, and so on, the safe hands, and it will all go back into the bottle. There are always going to be ebbs and flows in this movement, quite clearly. It may not necessarily sustain itself at the present level, but I don't see this going back into the bottle. I don't see this going back at all. I think it will flare up again. It's what Martin Luther King called actually the urgent necessity of now, which needs to be addressed, and take those democratic demands and link them into social justice and real change. And I think this movement is absolutely here to stay, and I find it quite inspiring.
Right, absolutely. Right, it's open for anybody who wants to contribute. I've got nobody with their hands up at the moment. I'm trying to find out where Richard got to. Seems to have gone. Nobody have any contributions or questions? I think we're all just completely flabbergasted and stunned by the reports from the comrades. I mean,
Hello, Roger.
Points. Marcus, yes.
Yeah, I'm Marcus from Cape Town, South Africa.
Hi, welcome.
Yeah, I just want to say I am extremely pleased to be here and listen to all the comrades from, and activist comrades from the United States speaking, sharing their experience. It's an extremely educational process for me. Of course, you read a lot about what's happening in the streets of America, but to actually hear the active participants in those processes sharing with us is really something special. So we really want to say thank you for your sharing that and for making this opportunity. I'm extremely delighted to be here, and I will stay until the end. So thank you very much to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. We've got Dave now, Dave Buxton.
I wanted to take up the question that Tia raised about how the community organises to protect themselves. And I think there's no easy answer to that question, especially like white or brown or black socialists in the UK can tell black working class people in America how to protect their communities. But certainly I would urge comrades in America to look at the history of struggle. And I think of the Black Panthers, who tried to organize in a revolutionary way to challenge the system. Now, I think they made some big mistakes, and I'm not someone who can go through all of that now, but certainly it was too male dominated, too militaristic, one might say. And if they looked at the history of the Black Panthers in terms of all the community work that they did and used those positive parts of the models to protect and build their communities, I think that would be a way forward. And particularly if black women in this case took the leadership instead of the black men, so that the women had more of a say about how the organization developed. But also, I'm not advocating that the black struggle should take place in isolation without white working class people, and we should be building those links wherever possible. And I'm going to make a bit of a leap, but this morning my daughter said that her friend said there was going to be a demonstration, Black Lives Matter. This demonstration was going to take place at 1 o'clock today, just across the road from where I live, about a mile across the road. So I went to go to this demonstration with my daughter. And in fact, there was another demonstration on this side of where I live. So I literally had to walk 50 yards out of my house, and there was a demonstration of the community in this area of London, East London. 150 people were there protesting about George Floyd and standing up against racism. Now, I'm 62 years old. I've been on many demonstrations all over the place. Many people would have wanted to go to central London to show their solidarity, but because of COVID-19 are fearful of travelling for good reason. Yet there are demonstrations taking place all over that we won't even know about. And I think that this is something that is quite unique, because we have a situation where social media can spread information around, and that's helping even in these times where we're supposed to be at home and isolated, we can still raise these issues that are of importance. So Tia felt, if you like, perplexed, agitated about the fact that, well, what about these other killings? And I think the thing is, you can't really predict when the movement will take off a certain incident. But what you can say, and I think with the George Floyd killing, is that this marks a significant change in people's consciousness. And I would also say that I think in the recent years with Bernie Sanders raising ideas of socialism and changing society in some form away from the two-party usual system of democratic capitalism or Republican capitalism, subjectively has an impact. Because if you raise the possibility of a different way of running society, then people's horizons change. They can think outside of the usual box. So I think we have to raise examples of, for people like Tia who are looking for answers, well, let's look to recent history in America, the Black Panthers and other organizations, but how we can adapt those for the times that we live in and build solidarity. And I think we've got a huge advantage now where that it can be seen that if it's more effective for all progressives, white and black, Hispanic, Asian, to work together to try and stop racism, which is an absolute necessity of capitalism, is to have racism to divide and rule. So I think that's the way forward in some small way.
All right, thank you, Dave. We've got nobody else indicated yet. Anybody?
Roger. Just,
Finn.
Yeah, just on Dave's point, the events in America have stimulated reactions in many, many cities of the world outside of America. We had a march in Dublin of about 5,000 people in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, even though it was prohibited under the COVID-19 regulations. And yesterday, about a quarter mile from where I live, 6 miles outside Dublin, a group of secondary school students marched through the housing estate here with banners saying Black Lives Matter. So the events in America have spread across Europe, certainly, and have raised the consciousness of people about racist issues, not just in America, but also in countries such as Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and also in Denmark, even in Denmark, we have seen. We had a big demonstration, I think, where there were 2,000 participating in front of US Embassy Sunday. And it has spread to 2 other cities also in Denmark. And of course it is in solidarity with the Americans, but it's also protest against the anti-immigration, well, what we have in Denmark, the, well, more or less racist approach to immigrants coming to Denmark. So, but I have a question also, because we have been speaking about the army and how it is. We have always said that soldiers, they are workers in uniforms, and I think one of the problems for the chief in the army is that I think it is 17% of the soldiers are Afro-Americans, and I would like to ask if, well, are there any signs of solidarity inside the army? Thank you.
I see that we've got Thomas from Germany here. You put a point up on the chat. Would you like to speak, Thomas?
Yeah, thanks, Roger. I enjoy to be here for a long time now. I join an international meeting like this, and there are very important points made by the comrades. And I have a special interest in the question which I wrote in the chat. Could you maybe, could any comrade maybe comment on the question of the international character of this movement? I mean, I can't remember in the last 30 years such an explosive and speedy movement around the world, and it's a spontaneous, completely spontaneous movement in a few days. I mean, apart from the question of the anti-Iraq movement and anti-war demonstrations, where we had already international movements and other movements, but you know, in such a, if you like, singular event, like there is one police attack, which is incredible, cruel, but you know, such a movement out of such a singular event, I think it's an incredible thing, and I would enjoy if somebody of you can comment on this, explosive international character of the movement. And well, I had at this time in Berlin an Alexander Place where we had in 1989 we were there with 1 million people against GDR bureaucracy on the same place. Now at the moment there are a few thousand people gathering and protesting against racism and in solidarity with the movement in the United States. And in 19 other cities at this time, in this hour now. I would like, maybe other comrades can report from their countries as well.
Ray, you want to speak now?
Yes, my first ever meeting of this kind. So from the WIN, thank you for inviting me, Roger.
Welcome.
It's quite clear from television pictures that the marches in the American cities are multiracial. A lot of young white people, I'm not sure of their class background, but they seem, you know, everything from working class people through to sort of middle class student type people, liberals of one kind or another. My question really for everybody is, to what extent could the American ruling class present this as a way of appealing to a kind of a white working class Trump base? To what extent is it? I mean, I'm hoping the answer is there is no extent, but to what extent could it be presented as a kind of a black workers or black people versus white workers movement? To what extent is it possible to sort of make concrete alliances with sort of white working class people? And it's an open question. I'm not saying it's impossible or it is possible. I'd like some of the American people, if there are any still around in this discussion, to kind of address that point.
Okay, I'm going to call Ed now and then Jack. I think Jack will answer your question, Ray, I hope. Well, and maybe Ed will too. Ed, you ready?
Yes, thank you, Roger. I just wanted to make a few comments, particularly in relation to what the last couple of speakers have said. That undoubtedly there's a very implicit international character in this movement that's bubbled up in Minneapolis, because it's spread over the world so quickly, and it's not just because of the terrible murder that took place by the police, but it's because in every other community there are issues that touch the same nerve. That I mean, we've had decades of austerity, we've had rising inequality in virtually every country of the capitalist world. On top of this, we've recently had the COVID epidemic, with all the sudden and dramatic illustrations that's brought about as to the insufficient medical facilities that there are in many countries of the world, and particularly it's aggravated the inequalities in society, because although you'd think that a virus would, from a purely biological point of view, would affect everyone equally, but because of the way communities are organized, the lack of space, the lack of facilities in the poorer areas, the fact that people from poorer communities have to do work that is more exposed to infection, more dangerous, that all these issues have come to the surface. And I believe in the fire brigade, when they're teaching people how to understand fires, they can be told that you can have a building where there isn't a fire, but just some tiny little change can suddenly engulf the whole building in flames as a kind of flashpoint. And in a way, this murder in Minneapolis has had that effect globally, that one, on the scale of humanity, one murder by one police officer of one man in the street is a small event, but it's an event that everybody in every country could relate to. And, it's true what comrades have said. I mean, not since the Vietnam War have we seen such widespread uprising all over the world around one issue. There is implicit in all this a recognition that the solution to the problem of police brutality is also international. That's very significant, because although most communities stepping into this action for the first time see it as an immediate objective, stop the police from killing any more young people, any more black people, stop the police from being so brutal, that bound up with that, and it's clear from the presidency of Donald Trump, bound up with that are a whole package of other issues about who owns and controls society, how society is being run, in whose interest society is being run. So, in response to what Ray just mentioned about, can this be portrayed as a white versus black issue, or is it a white versus black issue? I think it would be very difficult for anyone in authority to try and create that narrative, by the very fact that we've heard on the reports in this discussion this afternoon, that black and white young people are demonstrating together around this issue, because most white young people who have some understanding of issues of justice in society know that they cannot live in a society where blacks and whites are treated differently, because that contributes to all the other forms of inequality and injustice. It creates excuses for all kinds of brutality and so on. And white young people suffer as a result of those divisions within society as well. Of course, they don't suffer so much as black young people, but they do suffer. So, this is a turning point in world history. When this COVID crisis began, many of us were saying that the impact it would have on politics is somewhat analogous to the impact of the Second World War, where suddenly within a very short space of time, hundreds of thousands or millions of people learned, particularly in Europe, they learned that collective solutions are far better than the privatized solutions of capitalism. And this also represents a new departure in world history, where sometimes you can go for decades and nothing very much seems to change in politics. And then sometimes within the space of a few weeks or a few months, a whole century of changes can be compressed into a very short space of time. This is the starting point for a new wave of protest movements, similar to the Vietnam War, but with this difference, that after the Vietnam War, it was possible for capitalism to develop some new booms, some new economic growth, and some recovery. Now we have the birth of a worldwide protest movement with very, very little prospect of capitalism to show any way for living standards to rise, and therefore the implications in terms of the ability of us revolutionaries and socialists to demonstrate to people that an alternative form of ownership of the economy is something that can be and must be grasped. That is now a prospect for our movement. Thank you, Roger.
Jack, I see you. Jack wants to come in. Are you there, Jack?
Yes, I'm here. So first I want to comment on the question of the prospects of building this further and reaching out to more allies, and also the question of whether it's going to be possible to use this to antagonize and alienate white working class in the U.S. I think that we have to realize that part of the white working class in the U.S. is behind Trump. And they're behind Trump in part because of what was done to them through globalization. And you people in the UK, I'm sure, can relate because of the support that Brexit had. The support for Trump was initially, I think, not so much for him as opposed to the system. There were many people who were supporting both Bernie Sanders and Trump in 2016. However, in the US, there's always been a mixture in part of the working class where racism has been, the race card could be played because the scapegoating and the victimization of Black people has been used through Jim Crow in the South in the late 19th century. People may know that initially there were two populist parties in the U.S., two populist movements, one white and one Black, but they worked together, and they were divided. They were divided by victimizing, scapegoating, and convincing the white sharecroppers and poor workers that they were better off by being able to do better than Black people than by staying united with them. Tom Watson, who was a politician in South Carolina for decades, had originally been one of the main leaders of the Populist Party. And he went over as part of that movement and became a racist leader. Trump has, in a way, carries on that tradition. And right now, that card is being played every day in the press, in the media, and on the Fox News, and by Trump, appealing to white workers. That's what the media focusing on the violence, so-called, of the demonstrators is about. It's to say, these people are dangerous, these are Antifa, and they don't represent, the media says loudly, what so many of the peaceful protesters represent. Now, much of the media is moving in a different direction, but they're loud and clear on Fox News and in social media, that message is being delivered. Now, in fact, as Tia said, what's happening, and not just in Louisville, but in almost every city, is that during the day, there are large peaceful protests. Protests continue at night, and the police attack them, and they attack them viciously. And after the attack, groups separate and take out their anger and rage, and sometimes in some trashing and looting. Although that is more focused now against more upscale malls and stores and areas than it was in 1992 with Rodney King uprisings or in 1968 with the ghetto rebellions. So I also think that it's important to realize that there is a large part of the working class in this country, white workers, who are very much like many demographically, like many of the people here. In particular, there's a lot of working class youth who are participating in this. People who went through Occupy in Oakland make a lot of young people and their younger brothers and sisters make up a large part of what's going on. In Oakland, a few days ago, there was a march of 15,000 that started at Oakland Tech High School and marched down to police headquarters. It was organized by young people from the high schools and led by young people from the high schools. In San Francisco, the next day, there was a very large march from Mission High School. It was organized and called by a 17-year-old. And there were, I think, well over 10,000 people on that march. Young people and young people of color in particular are playing a very important role. I think we need to realize that a lot of what comes out of this is going to come through them and through their developing organization. And hopefully, we're going to be able to be a part and to help counsel, but much of the initiative, the dynamic, and the understanding is coming from them. One other point, which is we can expect that as has happened during Occupy and it happened in the 60s and so on, we're going to see a part of the Black leadership cohering around the idea that what the movement needs to do is to dump Trump and get off the streets. Take your movement off the streets and phone bank, knock on doors, that everything has to be put into dumping Trump, and that means abandoning the movement because we can't risk alienating and antagonizing people. That line is deadly. It's death, but it's been used time and again. It'll be the Black clergy. It's going to be a large section of the labor leadership. It'll be many of the NGOs, the Democratic Party, to a large degree, and we're already seeing that. Barack Obama has been rolled out. He came out of his retreat of 4 years, to announce that the important thing is to vote for, come out and vote. George Floyd's brother did the same. Politicians, labor leaders are going to be saying that over and over. However, there's a dynamic to this movement. There are many concessions that have been made already, which we couldn't have dreamed would have been made 10 days ago. And we're going to see more. And that's good. I believe the movement is going to move forward and that we can play a part in it. But I think that right now it's important that we play a mentoring role to the degree that, we're accepted to do that. As Tia said, there's a lot of suspicion understandably, in the Black community. I don't believe it's well-founded against us, but understand why that exists. And hopefully there are going to be militant organizations that will come out of this. That's essential to sustain it, because what we see in some ways is a compression of the various parts of the movements of the 60s, side by side, the mass peaceful movements, and you also see the militant, you see the street fighting, and so on. The 60s and Occupy, all these pieces are coming together in a very short and compressed time. But they can also be crushed as quickly as they came together. I don't believe that's going to happen, but some forms of organization, I think, are going to have to come out of this to sustain it.
Okay. Paul wants to come in. I also would like to have just 5 minutes. Paul, you ready?
Yes, thanks, Roger. Appreciate the invitation today. Apologies, I wasn't here from the very beginning due to family commitments, but I've been here since 2:30. I think it's been very interesting to hear from American comrades on the ground in different aspects, but I particularly I've also appreciated the comment from David, from Jim, and from Ed. I wanted to come back to what Thomas in Germany was asking about the international movement. While I've been listening, I've been receiving text messages from my comrades here in the UK that there could be anything up to 50,000 people on the streets of central London today. And some of my local comrades in Manchester are at the Manchester demonstration, which I haven't attended because of my age and medical recommendations. But they're talking about possibly 25,000. Now, even if you halve that because of comrades getting overexcited, and we've got maybe 12,000 people in Manchester, that's phenomenal. That is a phenomenal attendance. And it's not the first demonstration that's taken place, and there's another one scheduled for tomorrow. So this is something that's quite special that's going on. It's interesting that one of the leftish organizations in Britain called Stand Up to Racism, who I think may have an issue about the fact that Black Lives Matters is an independent organization, and they started saying last night, oh, well, maybe people shouldn't go to the big demonstrations. They should have local demonstrations in their streets, like the one that David Buxton has attended. He had a choice, I believe, of 2 demonstrations to go to. But there's something phenomenal about these big city demonstrations that are going on. And I think there are a number of factors, I think one of which is clearly lockdown, young people particularly frustrated at the lockdown conditions and what they've lost as well. It's not just a matter of they're frustrated, but what they've lost their university courses, their A-level courses, possibly the prospect of a job, you know, and there is a tremendous sense of loss, I think, among young people. And, you know, what have we got to lose? I think that there's communists have made a lot of analogies about the wartime situation and a complete change in people's habits and so on. And as we know, the socialist wartime conditions are very depressing, but they always lead to a revolutionary upsurge at the end. I think there's another factor as well in both Britain and America. I can only really speak about Britain, but I think this whole question about what it means to be Black or Asian minority ethnic in Britain, particularly in terms of COVID, there's been a huge amount of discussion in the media about the Black health workers who are in the front line, so many of whom have lost their lives. And even the non-health workers, everybody knows now that to be Black is to be exposed, and they understand that, or there's a glimmering understanding now that it's not anything genetic. It's about where you live. It's about multi-occupancy households. It's about low pay. It's about exposure to the virus on public transport to get to work for low paid, you know, in crowded times, and so on. People who can't afford to work from home. So I think that's a big factor as well. I won't go on for a long time, but in terms of what we need to take forward, I think one of the big things, and I'm a member of Socialist Alternative, and I've been watching what our Socialist Alternative comrades in America have been saying, and for me the big things are the importance of the unions. Comrades have been talking about the potential for splits. I don't think anybody thinks that that's likely, but the potential for a split could be overcome by the unions. And some of our comrades in Minneapolis who are bus drivers for the transit company made some headway in terms of refusing the use of buses to transport young people who'd been arrested, made a statement that they wouldn't allow the buses to be used in that way. And I noticed that the university, I think, and the public schools in Minneapolis have severed all connection with the police department, which is at least a step forward. I think in terms of the police itself, socialists have to have an answer to the question of the police. I saw a placard, an American placard, saying abolish the police, which probably isn't a placard you'd find on British demonstrations at the present stage, and which is not something that will probably gain an echo. They might want to abolish this police force. And I think socialists have to put forward slogans for a community rebuilding of a police force that would have where the community has control over hiring and firing, and the police force doesn't become a repository for every right-wing, white supremacist, that want to. And I think the final point I would make is that Sanders, some of these young people organizing these demonstrations are, if you like, disappointed refugees from the Sanders agitation. It's a couple of months now since he pulled out. But we have to pose, I think, for the American working class, the question of an independent working class party that would unite black and white workers. I hope I haven't spoken for too long, comrades. No,
not at all. Look, I don't have anybody else with their hands up. Perhaps I could just take the opportunity to say a few words myself. One thing we always face, is in normal periods, we often meet people who are in despair, and they say, why do people suffer? Why are people prepared to tolerate the way that they're exploited, the way that they're abused, the way that they're attacked day after day by the employers, by the states, and so on? You'll never get revolution. The people just haven't, they're diverted, they're confused, they won't stand up, and so on. And what we see is what Ed was talking about, how quantity becomes quality. You can have the drip, drip, drip for so long, and suddenly will be, the flood comes, or the explosion comes. We've had that, in so many times. I wouldn't say you have to go back to the Vietnam War to see this kind of international solidarity over a single issue. I mean, you remember that the Iraq War, we had demonstrations simultaneous demonstrations I can't remember, dozens of countries, dozens of cities around the world, dozens of capital cities around the world and local ones and so on. We had, I think it was 30 million people were on the streets on one day in protests against the impending Iraq War. We had the Occupy movement about 10 years ago, which just leapt from country to country. And of course, we've had, as Ray has pointed out, the Extinction Rebellion movement. I mean, I think in a way the world has become so completely integrated that this is not a new phenomenon. But what is incredible, I mean, we've had police killings of black victims is a daily occurrence, perhaps almost literally a daily occurrence in the USA. We saw just in the last few weeks, we saw this jogger who was murdered by passing ex-police thugs. We saw, of course, what happened in Louisville, which Tia has described already. The police just barging into somebody and murdering a woman in her bed. We've had, but all of these things, they aroused local protests, but they were almost kind of routine events we've seen over the period. We had Ferguson, the killing there a few years ago. We've had these kind of things, but this, suddenly, the drip, drip, it's gone too far. This was just the last straw, and we had this movement exploding. I mean, I'm just reading the reports and hearing the reports of the comrades. We can see that it's spread everywhere, not just to the big cities, but to little towns, as far as I can tell, little towns with white majorities, quite reactionary towns that have where the populations have voted for Trump and so on. I mean, something has just something has just snapped, and the dam has burst, if you like. And particularly, why would that be? Because, you know, I think in particular, what has been building up to this is the fact that it's the youth. I mean, all these demonstrations are by the youth and even by teenagers, and it's because there's probably never been a period when the youth of any generation has felt such despair about the future. No chance, as far as I can see, no chance of an education, no chance of proper housing, no chance of a job, no chance of having a higher living standard than previous generations. It's the first time, I would think, maybe I'm exaggerating, but I mean, I can't think of any time in the last half century or more when you could say that was the same. There was the same despair and anger and desperation among the youth, and well, really, that's that's the point I wanted to make. We're seeing, really, we are in the age of the world revolution. As I said, we were already marking, before the pandemic, we were seeing this phenomenon of uprisings in country after country, in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, in Europe. We saw the Gilets jaunes movement in France. We saw governments toppled in Algeria, in Sudan. We saw the incredible uprising of the people of Hong Kong, in Chile, in Lebanon. I mean, Ecuador. I mean, comrades, that's just a sample. And we've seen that was building up already. The pandemic, of course, has now really, you know, as was it, I can't remember, was it Voltaire who said that, or no, it was Dr. Johnson who said, you know, when you're about to be hanged, it concentrates the mind. Well, I think when, you know, when people are brought up against the reality of the really, literally, of life and death issues, they start thinking a bit more deeply about how society is run and what kind of solution they can find for it. And I think, you know, what we're seeing now, who would have guessed that America would be the country which really lit the fuse for the whole world? But I think that's what we're seeing now. I'd like to take this opportunity also just to say I hope comrades will have a look at our magazine, On the Brink. We have a website, www.onthebrink.online. You would find there the document we produced a few months ago, already a little out of date. Perhaps our magazine's title is a little out of date, no longer On the Brink, well over the brink. But in that document of ours, it's called 2020 Vision, and we really mapped out. Of course, we didn't predict the pandemic. We predicted this huge movement of uprising against capitalism. There's also our next meeting is going to be to launch a new pamphlet we produced. We can also find that on the website, which is called Labour and the Struggle for Socialism. And of course, it's a crucial issue for us now. Which way is the Labour Party going? This pamphlet traces the history of the Labour Party from its beginnings to the crossroads that it stands at now. I won't say any more about that, but the meeting, if anybody who wants to come, it's next Sunday, a week tomorrow, at 7 o'clock. And I have sent out the link to comrades, but if anybody wants, just contact us, email and so on. I can send it. I can resend it. Is there any other comrades who want to speak, or shall we say we've already gone well over 2 hours? Perhaps this is a good point at which to to close. Is there anybody want the last word? I think perhaps we'll say that that's it for today. I cannot overemphasize what an incredible contribution the comrades from the USA have made. And I think, I'm not sure if they're still here, but absolutely, this was one of the most one of the most important meetings that I can remember attending for a long, long time. So, say thank you to everybody. Do come to future meetings.
Thank you. Thank you very
Somebody-
much.
Okay, everybody. All right, I'll say goodbye to everybody now then. Thank you, comrades. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay,
Thanks.
bye.
Bye,
Come,
comrades.
bye.
Sono i confini, rosse bandiere, o proletari alla riscossa, bandiera rossa trionferà.